Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Land at Lunch session. This is part of our ongoing Land at Lunch series, which is going on across the winter and the spring. Today's subject is what is common good land and how is it managed, and you're hearing from myself and my colleague James McKesson-Leach. This is, of course, part of the work that Scottish Land Commission does. If you're not familiar with the Commission, we are a non-departmental government body, and our remit is based around land reform. We carry out policy and research work. We do a lot of comms and awareness raising, and we also have a good practice programme, and this Land at Lunch session forms part of the good practice programme. And good practice is really focused around land rights and responsibilities and the Scottish Government's land rights and responsibility statement, and looking at how those can be put into practice to advance things like community engagement, greater transparency of information and decision making, and diversification of ownership and tenure. So that's me for now. I'm going to hand you over to Lisa, who is going to talk you through some of the housekeeping for today's section, and then we'll move on with the presentation, which will be followed by a question and answer session.
Thanks, Gemma. Are you all right to take us out of screen share for a moment while I do that housekeeping and that first poll? And yeah, hi everyone. Just before we begin, I'm just going to, as I said, do some housekeeping and a first poll. So as you may have noticed from our holding slide and my message in the chat, the webinar today is being recorded, including the chat and the question and answer. Information on how this recording is used, you can find in our privacy policy. And there's, as I say, a link to that in the chat. Your camera and mic are off by default as we're in webinar mode, but we really welcome your questions in the Q&A box and comments in the chat box. Just a reminder, questions and comments in the Q&A box can be anonymous if you wish, but your screen name is always visible in the chat. We also have the option for you to turn on closed captions today, so you'll see some subtitles if that's helpful at the bottom of your screen. This function is enabled using the CC button on your control panel. Again, normally for most people at the bottom of your screen. Just to flag that these captions are auto-generated, so apologies, but any inaccuracies are out of our control. We're going to be collecting some feedback throughout the session in the form of 2 really super short Zoom polls, and we're grateful for your input into these. Again, these are completely anonymous too, and we don't share the answers to the entire group. And I'm going to also post more information on how that data is used in the chat too. Okay, so lastly, I just want to flag that we're going to signpost some resources today, and I'm going to post those links in the chat. So if you want to click through to those links, if any are particularly pertinent to you, you can get on that straight away. But we also collate all the links and also the recording of this webinar onto a single resources page. And I'm going to put the link to that resources page in the chat also at the end of the session. So hang around to the end so you get the link to that resources page with all those tools and resources and links collated in one place. If anyone's got any questions at any time about this housekeeping, just pop them in the chat and I'll see them and I'll do my best to answer them. But before I hand over to Gemma and James to do the main presentation today, I'm just going to do a quick poll to get your input and get a sense of who's in the room. So let me just launch that, 2 seconds. Okay, so hopefully you can all see a little box that's popped up on your screen with 4 questions. You might have to scroll down to answer all of those questions. So don't forget, there's more than one. Do scroll down and answer them all. Shouldn't take you too long. And as I say, this really helps us understand who's in the room. Both of these polls help us understand how to make events better and how to plan future events, what people would like to see, how we can shape them to make them most effective. So we're really grateful for you doing it. And I'm going to be quiet now and just give you a wee second to answer those questions. All right, I'm going to end that poll then. Fab, thank you so much again. And I am handing over now to James to start our presentation, and I'll see you a little bit later. But as I say, I'll be in the background if you've got any questions in the chat. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you can all see the slides back again. So I'm going to talk to you first of all about common good and essentially kind of what it is. So common good in many respects can be seen as the original form of community ownership in urban areas. So the assets that make up common good were granted to or acquired by the former boroughs over time. Common good land, particularly historically, was intended to provide the borough with a space to construct its civic buildings, hold markets, and as well as for things like recreation, grazing of livestock, collection of fuel wood, and other activities that may or may not be as relevant in the modern age as they were in centuries past. At present, Scotland's local authorities are responsible for managing the common good of the former boroughs, and every council area within Scotland contains at least one former borough, and in theory, its attached portfolio of assets. A few councils contain more than 10 former boroughs, and Fife is notable in having more than 20, I think 26 boroughs within its council boundary. There are a number of issues with common good, particularly as a type of property that's come down to us over the centuries. So first of all, determining when an asset is indeed common good and when it isn't can be a challenge. There are, because of that, a number of issues with legal imprecision, and specifically the statutory duties of local authorities and things like alienability, which I'll try not to go into too much detail about at the moment. And then, of course, what the purpose of common good is and how it should be recorded and managed in the 21st century. So, sticking with the definition for the moment, determining what is or what is not common good can be particularly challenging. But broadly, common good assets are those owned by the former borough councils at the point of their dissolution that had not been acquired for statutory purposes. Although that sounds relatively simple, poor record keeping and obviously several phases of local government reform and reorganisation from the 70s through to the 90s to the present day, it means that that's not always clear how or why property was acquired, and therefore what's actually common good now. Back in 2014, the Land Reform Review Group stated in their report that of the 197 former boroughs in Scotland, only 143 common good funds existed. And there is a lack of clarity as to how or why over the intervening centuries, 54 boroughs have lost all of their common good assets. So local authorities as the modern custodians of common good, but again, there's not a lot of detail on what that means. I mean, the underpinning act for common good is still, in many respects, the 1492 Act, which is significantly out of date and lacks detail that we require in the 21st century. But there are also those issues around alienability and inalienability and the use and development of those assets. So particularly this causes concerns in local communities because many of those assets are of significant heritage and cultural value. So there's good reason for protecting and preserving them for future generations, but also making use of them in ways that perhaps weren't envisaged centuries ago. And finally, for this part, just to reaffirm that common good relates to those land and buildings and assets held by former royal boroughs. But the last Royal Borough Charter was granted in 1700s. So there are a number of large Scottish towns and cities with no common good assets. So particularly thinking of the new towns, but they do have property that would or could be considered common good had they been boroughs. So things like their town halls, council chambers, and of course civic spaces, parks and green space would all normally be seen as common good. But for cities and towns that don't have a borough charter, there is no common good at the moment. But we'll pass on to Gemma now and see where we are with community empowerment in the 21st century.
Thanks, James. So yes, as James has said, a lot of the legislation that governs common good goes back quite some time. But in the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015, Part 8 of the Act was introduced, seeking to increase transparency about the existence of common good assets and to ensure there's community involvement in decisions taken about their identification, their use and their disposal. So the Act added some duties for local authorities, and the Scottish Government has published statutory guidance on common good land and buildings, and they've done that to support local authorities to carry out the new duties that have been imposed on them by the Act. So the duties are that local authorities must establish and maintain a register of property that is held as part of common good, and that they must make this easily accessible online. So when local authorities are establishing the registers, quite a lot of work can go into that. It involves, in some cases, looking into legal titles, establishing whether an asset is or isn't common good, and can take a bit of research and looking into. But once those lists have been compiled, the authorities have to publish those and consult with the community in each borough. And that gives communities an opportunity to look at the list and to identify if there's anything that they think should be a common good asset that is missing from the list, or to help them see where there are common good assets that maybe weren't aware of. And when a disposal or change of use is something that's assessed to be the best option by the local authority must consult with the community on that disposal. Local authorities must also make information about the income generated by common good land and assets clear and easily accessible, and this is something that can often be found in annual accounts. Although some authorities and some boroughs will have more detailed figures available and do that in different ways. And that brings me on to our protocol for good practice for common good assets. So this is one of our series of land rights and responsibilities protocols, and these are voluntary protocols that we've put together to help people understand some of the issues around different topics and to understand what they can do to demonstrate good practice, what that might look like and what actions they could take. So local authorities should provide details on the current use and management of assets. So that's something that we've put in the protocols, and that's going beyond just information that's in a register. We suggest that they identify the management of the assets, what are the assets being used for, and if it's known whether the status is alienable or inalienable. We also suggest that local authorities should provide clear contact details for those who manage and make decisions about common good land, and should ideally have a dedicated point of contact for common good matters. So, for example, in Highland Council there is a common good officer, and so there is a named point of contact and people know who to go to if they have an issue about a common good asset. Local authorities should also regularly review how community engagement is incorporated into the management of common good land, looking at how they make decisions and how they share that information with communities. The protocol also sets out that local authorities should encourage community involvement in the processes around common goods. That is encouraging communities to respond to the consultations that are happening and to take an interest in how those assets are being used and managed. And we also set out in the protocol that when a local authority is thinking about disposing of or changing use of a common good asset, whether that's a piece of land or a building, that it should consider whether this option is going to be something that will continue to deliver public benefit, and should also consider what impact disposal would have on the wider portfolio. Common good portfolios contain a range of assets, and some of those will be income generators for a fund, and it could be that disposing of one of those assets might have an impact on the future sustainability of that fund. So that's something that should be considered and assessed while making decisions. And finally, on transparency around decision making and processes, local authorities should ideally be transparent in communicating their processes, particularly for leasing or disposing of common good land. As there is legal imprecision in the legislation, some local authorities will have their legal teams look at what they would consider being a disposal when it comes to leases. So how long a length of lease would really be considered disposing of an asset. And because there isn't a precise figure around that, different local authorities will have come to different decisions. Some might consider a lease of longer than 20 years to be a disposal. For some, it could be 10 years. But the important thing is that they're really transparent about where those thresholds lie and what processes they would follow when making decisions, so that communities know what's happening. I'm now going to pass you on to James, who's going to talk a bit more about the future of common good.
So having had a kind of look at where we are in terms of good practice and where we've come from in terms of the history, there is definitely a vision for modernising common goods and how this could really be a game changer for urban land reform and community ownership in Scotland's towns and cities. So if you've got that portfolio of assets in that urban setting, what could it be doing to deliver greater benefit for the residents of those towns and cities. So we've been looking at the purpose of common good in the 21st century, and particularly how these could be used, but also the recording and management. And in 2019, we published a report prepared by the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, looking at existing practice and considering opportunities for common good going forward. So the three main options, and this is kind of more of a test of thoughts necessarily than any sort of recommendations, but the first option was to abolish common good, recognizing that as something that was centuries old and potentially designed for a different world, that there is a different way to manage public assets in the 21st century, and most public asset ownership in terms of land and property is done without common good status and without the history and the legacy that comes with. So certainly an option worth considering, the kind of the zero option there. Option two is looking at around community empowerment approach, so probably very much in line with where we are at the moment, focusing on kind of good practice and policy changes, but without kind of any sort of significant overhaul or reform, particularly in terms of legislation. And option three was to look at developing a new Common Good Act for Scotland, and that would kind of really give an opportunity to shape how common good portfolios work in their current phase, but also potentially open up common good to those other settlements that have grown up since the last borough charter was awarded in 1700. So the report essentially concluded that the common good in terms of the categorization rather than an abstract concept should be at the heart of efforts to ensure that Scotland's land and assets work for people. To deliver the changes set out in the report required both changes at the national level, for example, through that Common Good Act, but also requires that change in thought and practice at the local level. But fundamentally, we concluded that common good represents an extensive portfolio for which it should be possible to deliver and derive significant community, local economic and environmental benefit with the right governance and legal framework. As I've said, it could well be that game changer for urban land reform and community development, but also a catalyst to deliver the benefits of community empowerment and ownership in urban areas that have so far been under-realised. And I think that's where we'll leave it just now, but definitely an open area for us to do more work on and where we will be working on in the future. But I think now is probably time for some questions and answers.
Yeah, I'll just stop sharing the screen there. Thanks, James. Yeah, I guess I'll kick off the question we've got here, and it's about an example we have in our last paper. We've talked about common good assets delivering on local economic, social and environmental benefits, and there was a case in Portobello where the council was looking to do something with a common good asset for public benefits. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one in terms of particularly that kind of what counts as common good and then what's alienable or inalienable. So the Portobello story is very much around kind of Portobello Park being a common good asset. The Edinburgh City Council looking to build a new high school, which inevitably is very much in the public interest to have modern facilities for education, very much purpose, kind of part of local authority statutory purposes. But the site they'd chosen being a park and being that common good asset meant that they had quite a lot of legal wrangling to do to be able to build on it, to take that land out of the common good portfolio. And ultimately it ended up in a private act of parliament in the Scottish Parliament to enable them to do that. So that kind of highlights some of the issues and legal complexities. I mean, regardless of whether people think building a new high school is the right or the wrong thing to do, the fact that if they proposed another site for it, they wouldn't have had to worry necessarily about kind of the legal status of common good and ultimately go to Parliament and seek a private act to enable them to build it. So that gives a hint of as I say, the kind of some of the legal complexities. But yeah, they can be overcome at the moment, but I'm not recommending, I don't think anyone would recommend that private acts of Parliament are the way to go to develop common good land. There should be a much better joined up and community engaging process.
Thanks, James. We've had a few questions in. Please do use the question and answer box if you've got anything else you'd like to ask. I can see there are some questions in the chat as well, but they can be a bit harder to pick out. So the Q&A box would be great. So we've got a question here wondering if you could touch on the difference between alienable and inalienable land.
So So broadly, inalienable means that it cannot be changed. There is no chance for that common good asset to be used or disposed for another purpose than which it's being used for at the moment. That tends to be a narrower category of common good assets, and particularly buildings. So things like kind of townhouses and tolbooths tend to be inalienable, so they couldn't be sold and converted into kind of housing or other things. They are those kind of very kind of visible civic assets. Alienable common good tends to be more things like bare land, so that would also include kind of parks and green space, where there may be a good case, and going back to the Portobello one, to say actually we could take a bit of this public land, common good land, and actually use it for the public benefit. So for building a high school in the case of Portobello, but perhaps kind of other types of things if there are needs for enhanced facilities in the 21st century. So whether that's things like public toilets, for example, could be a pretty basic thing that might be useful to have in at the side of some green space or a park, but that requires kind of that process, but that should be permissible. But likewise, if there are other community interests, again, there is potentially a case to be made saying actually that they may well be perfectly good owners or managers of that asset, and that there really wouldn't be a loss to the common good, and therefore transferring that site, presuming it's alienable, would be permissible.
Thanks, James. We've had a question from Pauline saying that we've spoken about common good property, particularly in land and buildings, but can it also be money and art? And the answer to that is yes, there is a wide variety of assets that can be considered common good. Obviously, with our interest as the Land Commission, we focus on the land and buildings aspects of it, but there can be ceremonial garments, vases and robes. We're based here in Inverness, and there are common good assets here that include the Ness Islands, the fishing rights on the river, and there are provosts' lampposts that are installed outside the houses of local provosts. So there can be a wide range of assets that have been gifted to Royal Burghs and that form part of that portfolio. We've got a couple of other questions in here, so thanks very much for keeping these coming. James, I wonder if you could take this one. Does common good land only occur in urban areas? And is there a way to create new common good land?
So pretty much common good land at the moment is very much urban centric, and that's a legacy of being the land that was attached to the borough charter when that was granted by generally by a monarch in the medieval period. There are some places where, particularly I think the likes of Aberdeen, where there is a bit more common good land that's perhaps not quite in the city in terms of its historical sense. So there are definitely kind of assets that are on the kind of the urban fringe, if you like, but broadly common good assets tend to be very urban in character. Unfortunately, since the local government reforms in the 1970s, common good has been frozen. So there hasn't been the ability to create new common goods or to expand the portfolio. And that's one of the things that I think we would be looking at in terms of reform and a new Common Good Act is to free that up. And again, particularly for those places that were never royal boroughs, that never had that charter, but for those communities that equally value their civic space, their green space, and all the rest of it, to give them kind of the same sort of status as the assets in the historical towns and cities of the country.
Sure. We've had a couple of questions in. One is about the transparency aspect of common good, and one about from somebody who says they can't find a common good register on their local authority website. When did that requirement come into force, and should you be able to find it? So in terms of transparency and information, the Community Empowerment Act 2015 did bring in a requirement for local authorities to create, consult on and publish a register. But the Act didn't impose a time frame on doing that, and as I mentioned earlier, it can sometimes be difficult to identify the whole extent of a portfolio and the range of assets and of all of the buildings and land that should be part of it. So some local authorities haven't yet. There are some who have published and consulted and done some really good work around that. So for example, Fife have an interactive map-based register, really good way of seeing what assets there are there. And in Inverness, there are a couple of cases where there are former Royal Burghs, and initially it was thought they didn't have any assets. But a bit of investigation found that there should be assets, and those were reinstated by the local authority to those boroughs. So it's it's a difficult one, and it will depend in some parts who your local authority is, what kind of capacity they have, how complicated the portfolio is, and how much work it would take to establish that. But I can tell you the Scottish Government is currently reviewing the various provisions of the Community Empowerment Scotland Act, and we'll be looking at those common good provisions as well. So we might see some action on that. We've also, in relation to recording, had an interesting question from Richard about who's responsible for the recording and ongoing care of portable and movable common good heritage assets. So that goes back to the non-land and buildings assets that we've mentioned. And I do believe that local authorities would be responsible for the care and maintenance of those assets in the same way that they would be for the land and buildings that fall under the portfolio. So thanks very much for that question, Richard. James, I wonder if you want to take a question we've had in about the income from common good land and where that income goes.
Yeah, so for some common good portfolios, there might not be a lot of income, but for a number of them, there certainly are. So particularly kind of some of the larger cities, so Inverness is quite a good example where there is a very healthy portfolio, both of assets, but also in terms of income that's generated. And by and large, that income should go into the common good fund, the kind of the accounts for it. And usually it's spent on kind of things that are for the benefit of kind of local residents, or kind of to improve their lives, or for things even like Christmas lights and fireworks and that sort of thing. There is a question around whether that is the best use of these funds, and again, that's something that we'll be looking at, and particularly for those larger portfolios that have substantial incomes, whether yes, providing Christmas lights and fireworks and stuff is nice, but whether there is other investment that could be equally or kind of usefully done to support the towns and the cities where that's available. However, it is worth flagging that sometimes the management of common goods assets and the account can be a little less than transparent with some local authorities. And sometimes that money perhaps does disappear into local authorities' general accounts. So it's definitely something that shouldn't be happening anymore. But sometimes the way that some local authorities manage their common good portfolios, it does all get rolled into one, which means it can be challenging to see where income from the common good is going and how it's being spent, even if the outcomes are broadly the same as they would be in another local authority where that accounting is quite clear.
Sure. And we've had a point here from Katrina Hamilton that says a new Common Good Act would be good, as there's so much which would benefit from some guidance, organisation, accountability. And she asks, could there potentially be an overseeing body to hold local authorities responsible and to enforce transparency? I think that's one we don't have a definite answer for, but I think it's an interesting point to consider. How these things are overseen and how people can follow up on those. We've had someone has asked that the options that you had set out that came from the Clive report. Somebody asked you to touch again on the second choice that was there.
So the community empowerment option. So that's the one that's broadly, I think, where we are at the moment, where there isn't kind of any big move on the part of government or local authorities for kind of significant legal reform in terms of a new Common Good Act or kind of a very different direction, but more the kind of supporting the changes that have been made through the local authorities, kind of founding legislation from the 70s and the 90s and the Community Empowerment Act, and actually taking a kind of good practice approach that sees better transparency on the assets, their use and management, where those funds go, and that's probably a, kind of, that's an option to maintain rather than to go towards any significant reform, either in terms of a Common Good Act or abolishing the status altogether.
Thanks, James. We've just another question. We've still got a couple of minutes for questions. If you've got anything else you'd like to ask, please do just pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll see if we can get to them. So there's a question about, if a local authority occupies a store that is a common good property, should they pay rent to the Common Good Fund? And that's an interesting and challenging question, I think it's fair to say.
So, I mean, by and large, yes. I mean, the Common Good property is not the local authority's own property, and therefore, if the local authority is the tenant, there should be some sort of kind of tenancy agreement. Again, depending on the activity that the local authority is using that property for, it may be reasonable that the rent is a peppercorn rent. But at the same time, if it's something else, it may well be that rent should be a full market rent. So yeah, there definitely should be some sort of tenancy agreement in place and clarity around what rent is being paid. There probably should be something rather than nothing.
Yes, and as James said, it will vary by local authority as well, by what they're using the building for, and in some cases, there might be buildings that there's been quite a bit of investment in, and depending where that investment money has come from, if it's council funds, then they might feel it's okay to not pay the rent because they've contributed to the capital development of that building. But yes, complicated one. We've a quick answer here that Annette said. We've mentioned interactive common good maps. There are some on the Fife Council website, and I think they're should be fairly easy to find. But I'll see if we can make out a link to send to you. And we have a question in on, if faced with a lack of transparency, what advice would you give? And so that's a really good question, and thanks for asking. The answer is almost, it kind of depends on what the information is. There might be some things that you can't find on the council website, and if that's the case, then try and identify the correct contact and ask them for it. Obviously, public bodies do have obligations under freedom of information to provide you with information, but first off, you should just approach them and ask, and hopefully they can share that with you. It's also okay to ask if they're unable to provide information, why that's the case. Is it that they don't hold it, that they're not sure where to find it, or that they're not the right person to ask about it? So yeah, just kind of open up a dialogue, I think, and it is something, speak to the council officers who are responsible. You might want to try the property department, it might be the legal department, it will depend on who you're speaking to. James, do you have anything else you would add to that? The
other thing is try your local councillors. I mean, as the elected members, they are ultimately responsible for the decision making in the local authority area, and that includes decisions over common goods management and use. So yeah, track down your local councillor and hold them accountable as well. Great. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, so I will bring Lisa back in to finish off.
Thanks. And thanks to both of you for a really great presentation and for answering all the questions. And thanks to everyone in the Zoom room for a really active discussion and lots of really, really pertinent questions. So it's really fab to see. I'm going to launch our second poll now, which gives you the opportunity to give us a little bit of feedback on how today went for you and to help us plan for future events. So I'm going to launch that, let you get started, and do a few last little bits of information in the background while that's happening. Okay, so let me get the tech going here. Okay, once again, you should be able to see a box pop up on your screen. And if you could scroll through those questions and have a go answering them, that would be super helpful. The other things I wanted to say was that in a moment, I'm going to pop the link to the resources page into the chat. And I'll also put the the links and information to be able to contact the good practice team here at the Scottish Land Commission in there to our email and our phone number. So if you have any specific questions or things you think of afterwards that relate to the subject that you want to ask, just get in touch. If there's anything, I can see one last question has come into the chat. So yeah, if your question hasn't been answered today or there was something that you didn't ask, do please get in touch with us, and of course we'll do our best to answer that or support you. Okay, so I'm going to put those links in the chat and I'll be quiet now and let you get on with that poll.
Thanks everyone. So yeah, this is a fortnightly session. So in 2 weeks' time, on Wednesday the 15th of February at 12 p.m, you can join our colleague David Stewart, who will be talking about shaping markets to create better places, and looking particularly at land assembly by the public sector. And that'll be a really interesting session. So you can book online at landcommission.gov.scot. If you head to our events page, you'll see the link for that and for our later sessions in March, available there for registration. So thanks very much everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you again soon.